In this lesson I'm going to show you how you can work with some of the equipment that you might have at home to build up some samples for your textile project. So this idea is using your felt tip pens to add colour to your background, to your whatever it is that you're working on. So you can, all of you have probably got an old shirt that you could use, and if you haven't got an old shirt you could use something like a pillowcase. Working on white is good because you can add the colour that you need to with things like felt tip pens. And then you can build in, say you've only got black, you can build in the main detail with some black. Or if you have only got white, if you build in darker colours onto your white, you can stitch the white on top for the highlights or for the detail. You can use some of the templates that I put on the PowerPoint if you want. Or with white, it's easier to draw your design straight onto the fabric because you can just trace it straight through like that. So you can just get a pencil and you can take off the parts of the design that you want. Then once you've got your outline, you can add a bit of colour. So these are just basic colouring pens that I've got here, but it's quite nice to do a combination of different colours. Now I'm going to leave anything that you want to be white, obviously don't put any colour onto that. So I'm going to leave the highlight of the eye, which is that bit there, for now. I'm going to put a little bit more of this blue into it, because obviously you don't get a solid colour in the iris. Now you can also, you might only have one blue, so you might want to put another colour behind it, and then you might stitch in some detail to give it a little bit more texture and a little bit more interest afterwards. Leave some white highlights in there. You can even put a bit of brown in there as well. Now can you, I don't know if you can see on the video or not, but it is actually bleeding where this colour is wet. And now put black onto the next to the wet, it's bleeding in, so it's breaking out a little bit. That is actually quite interesting, that edge, because you wouldn't get like a really perfect edge on the iris anyway, so it's quite nice to do that. But as I say, don't add too many different, too much of one colour at one time. Work in some other colours. So by adding a little bit of brown in there, I'm just making it a little bit more realistic. Now, if you haven't got any colouring pens, you can actually use colouring pencils on here as well. So I can add a little bit of tone with my brown. So I could put in the tone of the eye, the skin colour. And it doesn't have to be realistic. You know, if you've only got a certain, say for example, you did want to experiment with just all colouring pens, like this one that I showed you to start off with, it's not exactly realistic colours in there. And when you build up the colours on top of one another, you build up darker areas. So I waited for it to dry and then I added a bit more colour to deepen and add a little bit more tone so it looks a little bit more realistic. It doesn't have to look realistic, obviously. You can do something abstract like some of the ones I've shown you on the PowerPoint. Anyway, so you can, anywhere that needs to be darker, you can build this up with, you see I'm pushing a bit harder in here because this is a fold of the eye and it's a bit darker in there. And then I want this top part of the eye to be a bit lighter. You can also, if you haven't got any colouring pencils or colouring pens, you can just add tone just with the pencil. So you can use the side of the pencil and you see how I'm building a bit of tone up in there as well. Okay, so you've got a few options there to add a bit of tone and colour before you start adding your stitches. So now that I've got a bit of basic colour on there, I'm going to show you how you can use backstitch to enhance these areas here and put things like the eyelashes in. So you can pencil out where you want them first. I've started to do that, but just put a few more in. So I'm making them reasonably straight because obviously it's going to be easier to create those with stitches if they're straighter rather than trying to do some big kind of almost fake curly ones. Start off with about 60 centimetres, so I'm going to double this up so you can see it a little bit easier. So I would do that, cut the end of it off. I'm just using paper scissors just to show you that I can do all of these things with paper scissors at home as well. Look down the eye of the needle and thread it and then pull it, pull the two ends together, and then I'm going to put it around my fingers, make a loop. Put the end of the thread through the loop like that. A couple of times. The more you do it, the bigger a knot you'll have. And then pull it into the knot like that. towards the end of the thread. So I'm going to start at the back of my work because I don't want that to be at the front of my work. Or you might want it to be at the front of your work if you wanted to create lots of eyelashes coming out like that, but you'd have to do them individually, like one at a time coming through. But let's just stick with what I was going to do first. So I might want to start with these eyelashes here. I might come down here first. So I've come through the back of the work. I'm going to come behind myself a little bit here and then rotate ahead of the stitch that I just made. So this is called back stitch. Most of you have done this before, but you may have forgotten. Okay, then I'm going to come back into the last stitch. So that's the end of the last stitch that I've made, the last complete stitch. Put the needle into the work, rotate it, come forward. So I'm doing these are about 5 millimeters apart. Put that straight. Now I'm not working with a frame here. If you've got a frame, you can put your work in a frame so that it doesn't buckle up so much, but most of you won't have a frame. So if you don't, obviously I'm not going to use one because I'm going to show you how you can do it if you haven't got a frame. The main thing to watch with this if you're not using a frame is that you don't pull your work too hard. So if you pull it too hard, you're going to buckle up your work. So if after each stitch you put it out flat again, you'll make sure that you don't buckle your work up. It's easier to do this on a woven fabric like this old shirt that I'm using, because if it was a knitted fabric, it would crumple up a lot easier. This is staying quite nice and firm, especially where I put the extra colour on it. It's actually keeping it even firmer because the pencil is within the fibres and it's giving it a bit more stiffness, which is making it easier. If you use the colouring pens, if you've got colouring pens, especially if you've got the markers, it actually goes really firm. Can you see how that's gone like kind of, it's almost like a tea stain really. You could even experiment with putting tea on, couldn't you? Because it's kind of a bit like skin tone. So that there is where I built up the different layers. So it's using the same pen, but I waited for it to dry and then I applied another layer. So it's bled like it would do, excuse me, bled a little bit like it would do with watercolour if you're working on paper and watercolour. So that's something you could, I'm showing you this one though because this one's easier to achieve if you haven't got many colours. This you can just do if you wanted to, just with colouring pencil if you didn't have any colouring pens. Okay, so back into the last stitch, rotate it. So you could do that for your full line along there. And then if you started to get bored, you could come up and you could play with these eyelashes back into that bum. So these, the ones at the end, might be slightly longer than the ones here. If you look at your eyelashes, generally the ones towards the end are a little bit longer, aren't they? And I might come here, like that. So you can possibly see how I've curved that off a little bit. See, so because I've done it gradually, I've curved it up slightly. Now if I did it just straight, you see the difference. If it's just straight, it doesn't look as quite as realistic, but you can do that. So I could come down into here and then just rotate into the next bit of the work where I'm going to come out next. So that's the difference between just the straight one and the slightly curved one. So I've spent about 20 minutes building up the eyelashes, a little bit of the eyebrows and some of the crevices in the eye socket. Some of them like major lines. You obviously won't want to cover it too much with these thicker lines because it would be too overpowering. But I'm going to show you in a minute how you can use some finer lines to build up some of these softer like kind of contours that you've got going on. But while I've got some blue in here, I'm just going to show you what I'm doing here. Now you might not have any blue thread. You might have at home something like this, one of these kits that you get. Sort of the repair kits, and there might be some grey or some blue that you can use in there to add some highlights in here or some lowlights. Lowlights meaning darker. So I'm just going to show you what I would do or what you can do if you have got a few extra colours. So I've obviously coloured the outside as I showed you earlier with the pen and a little bit of pencil as well. And now I'm just going to use the same back stitches to put a few lines in here around the iris. I'm going to come there. So save wasting too much, I'm going to come just across just a couple of mil this way out again, and then I'm going to go up, out towards the outside of the iris like that. It's gone quite crusty where I put the colour on it, which is good because it's keeping it firm. Okay, you see I've just come across a little bit there, and the reason I've done that is because then I'm not wasting too much of my thread by going all the way back to the middle again. I've only kind of used about 2 mil of thread on the back of the work. I'm going to come across here and come across just next to where I want to come out again. Okay, so some of these could be longer, some of them could be shorter. If you look at the eyeball itself, and if you look in the mirror, you'll see that the colour, you can get these kind of streaks of colour in your eye. Sometimes you've got all sorts of things like green in there and brown within a blue eye. So you could, if the other colour that you've got is brown, put some brown in here. Come down back into here, rotate it again to here. Okay, so just keep making sure that it's smooth. If you do too many stitches and it's buckled up, it's difficult to make it flat again. If you catch it before you carry on, you can flatten it out nicely. Back into the middle again. Make a little short one here. I'm going to come to the edge here and I'm going to use this blue where I want it to be a bit darker. So the top of the eye is going to be darker than the bottom because it's more light hitting there. So I might come up to my edge here and do a few back stitches into this edge. Back in there. And I'm just going to tie off now. I might come back in and work a bit more in there, but you can see how that's dark on that edge a little bit at the top there, so you probably would do it over this side as well. So before the loop disappears, put the needle through the loop. That's just reminding you how you tie off, if you've forgotten. Needle through the loop, pull it into a knot and cut it off. So I've used a thicker double thread where I want the eye socket to be and where the eyelashes are and where the outer line of the eye is. But where you've got the inner line of the eye that hits the eye socket, the eyeball, and these kind of lighter lines around here and maybe some of the hairs, you probably would just want to use a single thread. So I'm going to do that with a single thread. I've tied a knot at the end. I'm going to come through the back. And you might not want it to be a completely solid line either, so that you can show where the highlights are. I'm still going to use back stitch though. So I'm going to come back into that last stitch where that is a bit thicker. Come forward a little bit. Back into there. Rotate it. So now I'm back onto back stitch again. So can you see the difference? I've got a much finer line. So it's highlighting that edge, but it's not as prominent as things like the eyelashes, obviously. Okay, can you see the difference between those stitches now? Just finish that off and you might be able to see a bit better. Okay, so you can see the difference between the thicker and the finer thread stitches and how it's kind of tapering. It gives the impression that it's tapering out a little bit into the highlights, and I've left my highlight here for the light coming through because the light's coming on this side of the eye. So I've left a bit of a highlight there. I would want a little bit of a black line underneath there leading up into there. But I'm going to let you crack on and have a little go at that. And I really look forward to seeing what you get up to.